Tonight, in Jakarta, the city that was supposed to prove Southeast Asia could build a megacity is sinking into the ground. The Indonesian government launched a $40 billion sea wall project to hold back the Java Sea. They announced a brand new capital on the island of Borneo, and none of it addresses why Jakarta is actually drowning. But here is where it gets interesting. Jakarta is not sinking because of the ocean. Jakarta is sinking because of what the city is doing to itself. 40 million residents share a metropolitan area where less than half have access to piped water, so they drill wells. Thousands of illegal wells, extracting 3 million cubic meters from the aquifer every single day. Every liter removed causes the loose sediment above to compress. The ground does not bounce back. North Jakarta has dropped 4 meters in 40 years. Some neighborhoods sink 25 centimeters annually. That is faster than Venice, faster than New Orleans, faster than anywhere else ever measured. What is happening in Jakarta is not a flooding problem. It is not a trash problem. It is not even a climate problem, though climate is making everything worse. It is a story about what happens when a megacity drinks itself to death and uses 13 rivers to spread the consequences into districts that were dry a decade ago. Indonesia's solution is not to save Jakarta, it is to abandon it. And the 10 million people who cannot afford to leave are watching the water rise. Here is a claim that used to be impressive. Jakarta built one of the largest megacities in the southern hemisphere on a river delta. 13 rivers flow through Greater Jakarta, draining from the volcanic highlands of West Java into the Java Sea. The original city was called Batavia, a Dutch colonial trading post designed around canals and waterways that served maybe 100,000 residents. The Dutch understood water. They engineered the city to flood in controlled ways, to drain predictably, to coexist with the delta geography that made the location valuable in the first place. That was 300 years ago. Today, 40 million people live in the Jakarta metropolitan area. The colonial canal system was never expanded to match. The rivers became the only drainage infrastructure for a population 400 times larger than what the system was designed to handle. Engineers call this a legacy system. What it actually means is that Jakarta is running 21st century traffic through 18th century pipes. For decades, the arrangement worked well enough. The city grew, the economy boomed. Jakarta became the financial heart of Southeast Asia, generating $300 billion in annual economic output. Indonesia pointed to its capital as proof that a developing nation could build infrastructure that rivaled the West. That is the story Jakarta tells itself. Here is the reality. Less than 40% of Jakarta residents have access to piped municipal water. The system simply does not reach them. So they drill wells. Households drill wells. Factories drill wells. Office buildings, hotels, shopping malls, apartment complexes. Estimates suggest more than 4,000 illegal wells operate in North Jakarta alone. Licensed wells number in the tens of thousands more. The total extraction is approximately 3 million cubic meters every single day. That is 3 billion liters of water pulled from the aquifer underneath the city. And here is what nobody explained to the residents drilling those wells. Jakarta does not sit on bedrock. It sits on alluvial deposits, loose sediment, river mud compressed over millennia into something that feels solid until you remove what is holding it together. Groundwater is what holds it together. The water fills the spaces between sediment particles, maintaining pressure that keeps the ground stable. When you pump that water out, the particles compress. The surface above drops. And unlike a sponge, alluvial sediment does not expand again when the water returns. The compression is permanent. Here is the number that matters. North Jakarta has sunk 4 meters since the 1980s. 4 meters. That is a 2-story building disappearing into the earth. The current rate in the worst affected areas is 25 centimeters per year. For context, Venice sinks 1 to 2 millimeters annually. New Orleans sinks about 5 millimeters. Jakarta is sinking 50 times faster than Venice. The city is dropping into the ground 10 times faster than sea levels are rising around it. The government is building a $40 billion seawall to keep the ocean out, but you cannot build a wall against the ground disappearing underneath you. And the rivers that were supposed to drain the city have become something else entirely. So what happens when 13 rivers flow through a sinking city? They overflow, and what they carry does not stay in the water. The Siliwangi River runs directly through the center of Jakarta. It begins in the highlands south of the city, passes through dense urban neighborhoods, and empties into Jakarta Bay. Along the way, it collects everything the city discards. Household trash thrown from bridges, industrial discharge piped directly into the current, raw sewage from the 96% of Jakarta that is not connected to any treatment system. By the time the Siliwangi reaches the sea, it barely qualifies as water. But the Siliwangi is not even the worst. The Citarum River flows into the region from the east, supplying 80% of Jakarta's surface water for agriculture, industry, and the municipal supply that reaches the lucky 40% with pipe connections. International researchers have ranked the Citarum among the most polluted rivers on Earth. In some stretches, the water is invisible beneath a solid carpet of plastic bottles, food wrappers, and foam packaging. Textile factories along its banks discharge dyes and chemicals directly into the flow. The river changes color depending on what the factories upstream are producing that week. Here is the number that matters. Approximately 20,000 tons of trash enter Jakarta's river system every single day. That is 7 million tons per year flowing through the city and into the bay. The World Bank documented this figure, environmental agencies have confirmed it, and the volume keeps increasing. The rivers were designed to drain water. They have become highways for waste instead. And here is where the sinking problem makes everything worse. When land subsides, it changes how rivers behave. Channels that once flowed predictably now overflow more frequently. Floodplains expand. Water reaches areas that the original Dutch engineers never imagined would be wet. The districts of East Jakarta and Bekasi sit kilometers from the nearest major river channel. A decade ago, they flooded occasionally during extreme monsoons. Now they flood routinely. The land between them and the rivers has dropped. The barriers that once contained overflow have sunk below the new water levels. Every flood event pushes river water further into neighborhoods that have no historical experience with contamination. This is what residents mean when they say the waste is spreading to new districts. It is not a metaphor, it is hydrology. As Jakarta sinks unevenly, the rivers find new paths, and those paths carry everything the rivers contain. What do they contain? Researchers from Indonesian universities have cataloged the inventory. Heavy metals from textile manufacturing, lead, mercury, and cadmium in concentrations that exceed safe limits by orders of magnitude. Medical waste documented in river surveys, including syringes and pharmaceutical containers from hospitals that discharge without treatment. Fecal bacteria at levels that would close beaches anywhere in the developed world. And microplastics. Studies of Jakarta Bay have recorded some of the highest microplastic concentrations ever measured in coastal waters. The plastic does not disappear. It breaks into smaller pieces and enters the food chain. All of it washes downstream. All of it ends up in Jakarta Bay. And during floods, all of it spreads across neighborhoods that were never supposed to be in the contamination zone. The city knows this. Jakarta operates river cleanup programs that remove millions of kilograms of trash annually. Boats with nets skim the surface. Workers and waiters pull debris from the banks. The government announces the tonnage collected as evidence of progress. Here is the problem. The tonnage collected keeps increasing because the tonnage entering keeps increasing faster. An Indonesian environmental official described the situation to reporters with unusual honesty. Cleaning the rivers, he said, is like mopping the floor while the tap is running. The tap is 40 million people generating waste in a city where solid waste collection reaches only 60% of households. The rest goes into the streets, the gutters, the drains, and eventually the rivers. The rivers carry it downstream until they overflow. and then the waste arrives in neighborhoods that thought they were safe. But the trash you can see floating on the surface is not the real threat. What is killing Jakarta is invisible, and it is rising from underneath. Here is a number that should be impossible for a city of 40 million people: 4%. That is the percentage of Jakarta connected to centralized sewage treatment. For context, Bangkok connects 50% of its residents to sewage systems. Kuala Lumpur reaches 80%. Singapore achieves 100%. Jakarta, the largest economy in Southeast Asia, the city that hosts international summits and Fortune 500 regional headquarters, processes the sewage of 4 out of every 100 residents. The other 96% rely on septic tanks, pit latrines, or direct discharge into waterways. Septic systems work through a simple mechanism. Waste flows into an underground tank where solids settle and bacteria break down organic matter. The remaining liquid drains into a field of perforated pipes buried in soil, filtering slowly through the ground before rejoining the water table. The system requires one condition to function: the soil around the drain field must be dry enough to filter the effluent. Here is the problem. Jakarta is sinking into a rising water table. The same groundwater extraction that causes subsidence also lowers the aquifer temporarily in some areas, while flooding saturates others unpredictably. Septic drain fields designed for soil conditions that existed 20 years ago now sit in ground that is perpetually waterlogged. When the soil cannot filter, the sewage has nowhere to go. It pools on the surface. It seeps sideways into neighboring soil, and it drains into the same aquifer that residents are pumping for drinking water. This is the loop that is poisoning Jakarta from below. Residents drill wells because piped water does not reach them. The wells pull water from an aquifer contaminated by failing septic systems. The pumping causes the land to sink. The sinking raises the relative water table. The higher water table causes more septic systems to fail. More sewage enters the aquifer, and residents keep drinking from wells because they have no alternative. Researchers testing shallow wells across Jakarta have found fecal coliform bacteria in more than 80% of samples. The contamination is not localized to industrial areas or informal settlements. It is everywhere. Scientists measuring E. coli levels in Jakarta's rivers have recorded concentrations 50,000 times higher than World Health Organization guidelines for safe recreational water. 50,000 times. These are not rivers. They are open sewers with current. The health consequences are exactly what you would expect. Jakarta reports diarrheal disease rates among the highest in Southeast Asia. Hepatitis A outbreaks occur regularly, traced directly to contaminated water sources. Children in North Jakarta show documented developmental impacts from lead exposure, the heavy metals in industrial discharge concentrating in the same water supply that families use for cooking and bathing. Public health researchers estimate that water-related illness costs Jakarta $1.4 billion annually in healthcare expenses and lost productivity. That figure does not include the deaths that go unreported in informal settlements where residents cannot afford hospitals. The government has known about this for decades. In 1991, Jakarta launched the Sewerage Development Project with funding from the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. The plan called for 80% sewage coverage by 2020. Engineers designed treatment plants. Officials announced timelines. International donors contributed hundreds of millions of dollars. Here is what actually happened. By 2020, coverage remained at approximately 4%, the same number it was when the project started. Land acquisition stalled because property owners refused to sell at government rates. Construction costs exceeded budgets that were never adjusted for inflation. Corruption investigations interrupted implementation. Political leadership changed and priorities shifted. The treatment plants that were built operate below capacity because the sewer lines to connect them were never completed. The current plan calls for 80% coverage by 2050. That is the same promise made in 1991, pushed back another 30 years. Meanwhile, the population keeps growing. The septic systems keep failing. The aquifer keeps absorbing sewage from 6 million households that have no other option. Jakarta is not just polluting its rivers with street trash, it is poisoning its own drinking water with sewage from 96% of its residents. And the government's response has been to announce projects that never get built. The officials knew this was happening. They commissioned studies, they held press conferences, they promised progress that never arrived. Nobody prepared for what happened in January 2020. If you want to see where the crisis becomes personal, drive to Muara Baru on a morning high tide. The neighborhood sits in North Jakarta, wedged between the seawall construction zone and a fishing port that has operated for generations. The families who live here are not reading World Bank reports about subsidence rates. They are wading through sewage to reach their front doors. Muara Baru was a fishing village before Jakarta swallowed it. Residents built homes near the water because proximity to the port meant income. Their fathers fished these waters. Their grandfathers fished these waters. The community made sense when the land was stable and the bay was clean. Now the land sinks faster than anywhere else in the city. The seawall project that is supposed to protect North Jakarta required demolishing hundreds of homes in the construction path. Families who had lived on the same plots for 3 generations received compensation that covered maybe 2 months of rent elsewhere. Those who refused to leave watched bulldozers approach. Those who accepted the money discovered that nowhere else in Jakarta was affordable on fishing income. The residents who remained describe a life organized around water, not in the way their parents experienced it. They wake up and check the tide charts to know if they can leave their homes without boots. They keep furniture elevated on concrete blocks. They send children to school through streets where the flooding mixes with drainage from septic systems that stopped functioning years ago. One fisherman told a reporter that he used to make his living from the water. Now the water is making him sick. But Muara Baru is just one neighborhood. Across Jakarta, approximately 1.2 million people live in flood-prone kampungs. These are informal settlements, communities that grew organically over decades in areas that formal planning ignored. The residents have no legal land title. They built homes on ground that the government never officially recognized as residential. This means they have no legal claim to compensation when flooding makes their neighborhoods uninhabitable. They cannot sell property they do not technically own. They cannot relocate because they have no assets to relocate with. Here is what the subsidence maps reveal when you overlay them with income data. South Jakarta sits on higher ground. It floods less frequently. It is also where the wealthy live. North Jakarta sits on the coastal plain. It sinks fastest. It floods most often. It is also where the poorest residents concentrate. The geography of drowning in Jakarta follows the geography of poverty with almost perfect precision. The factory owners who pump the most groundwater can afford to move their operations. The families drinking contaminated well water cannot afford to move anything. The people who cause the least damage are absorbing the worst consequences. And the people making decisions about Jakarta's future do not live in neighborhoods where the sewage rises with the tide. Scientists warned for years that Jakarta was approaching a threshold. They published papers. They presented data to government officials. They used words like critical infrastructure failure and cascading system collapse. The warnings described exactly what would happen if a major rain event coincided with high tides and saturated ground. Nobody prepared for it. Then came New Year's Day, 2020. On the night of December 31st, 2019, Jakarta residents celebrated the arrival of a new decade. By morning, the city was underwater. 377 millimeters of rain fell in 24 hours. That is more than Jakarta typically receives in the entire month of January. It was the heaviest recorded rainfall since meteorological records began in 1866. 150 years of data, and nothing compared. The rivers overflowed within hours. The Siliwangi broke its banks before dawn. The Pisanggrahan followed. Floodwaters rose so fast in some neighborhoods that residents climbed to their roofs in darkness, waiting for rescue boats that took days to arrive. By the time the rain stopped, 66 people were confirmed dead. Thousands more were injured. 400,000 residents were displaced from homes that were suddenly uninhabitable. The economic damage reached $1.4 billion in a single week. That figure covered only the losses that could be documented. It did not include the informal economy, the street vendors whose inventory was destroyed, the day laborers who lost weeks of income, the small businesses that never reopened. Here is what made the 2020 floods different from previous disasters. The water reached places it was never supposed to reach. Jakarta's flood models were built on elevation data from decades earlier. The maps showed which neighborhoods were at risk and which were safe. Emergency planners used those maps to position resources, to design evacuation routes, to decide where to build shelters. But the maps assumed the ground would stay where it was. The ground had moved. Subsidance had redrawn the city's topography since the models were created. Areas marked as low risk on official maps were now lower than areas marked high risk. Pump stations designed for 1980s elevations sat below the floodline. Drainage channels that once flowed downhill now flowed in directions the engineers never intended. The water found the new low points, and it carried everything the rivers contained. East Jakarta received contaminated floodwater from channels 20 kilometers away. Neighborhoods that had never experienced river overflow found themselves submerged in a mixture of rainwater, sewage, industrial discharge, and decomposing trash. The new districts phenomenon that scientists had predicted was no longer theoretical. Families in areas with no flooding history were suddenly pumping toxic water from their living rooms. The cleanup took months. The contamination in the soil is permanent. 2 weeks after the floodwaters receded, President Joko Widodo announced the acceleration of a project that had been discussed for years. Indonesia would build a new capital city, not in Java, on the island of Borneo, 2,000 kilometers away. The project was called Nusantara. The budget was $32 billion. Government functions would relocate over the following decades. The message was clear. The response to Jakarta's worst flood in 150 years was not a plan to fix Jakarta. It was a plan to leave. Other cities have faced this same crisis. Some of them chose differently. Tokyo faced the same problem 50 years ago. The city was sinking. Groundwater extraction had caused subsidence across the metropolitan area. Engineers measured the decline and projected catastrophe if the pumping continued. The Japanese government responded with force. They banned private well drilling. They built a municipal water system that reached every resident, eliminating the need for personal extraction. They constructed underground cisterns of almost unimaginable scale. The G-Cans project created cathedral-sized reservoirs beneath the city, capable of holding floodwater that would otherwise inundate streets. The system looks like science fiction. Massive concrete chambers connected by tunnels wide enough to drive trucks through, designed to absorb excess water and release it slowly after storms pass. The result was definitive. Subsidence in Tokyo essentially stopped by the 1970s. The city still exists because the government decided it would. The Netherlands offers another model. The Dutch have been managing water for centuries. They do not fight floods. They accommodate them. The Room for the River program deliberately creates zones where water is allowed to spread during high events, reducing pressure on urban areas. Dutch engineers understand that you cannot wall out physics. You can only negotiate with it. Jakarta was literally designed by Dutch colonial engineers. The Indonesian government has access to Dutch expertise through development partnerships. The knowledge exists. The technology exists. The proof that these approaches work exists in cities that implemented them decades ago. Here is why Jakarta is different. Tokyo acted when subsidence rates were 4 centimeters per year. Jakarta is sinking at 25 centimeters per year. Tokyo had a strong central government with authority to ban private wells and enforce the ban. Jakarta has regulations against illegal wells that go unenforced because the agencies responsible lack resources and political backing. Tokyo built a municipal water system before banning wells, giving residents an alternative. Jakarta's piped water reaches less than 40% of the population. You cannot ban wells when 60% of residents have no other way to drink. To stop the pumping, you must first provide water. To provide water, you must build infrastructure. To build infrastructure, you need money and coordination and time. Jakarta has none of these in sufficient quantity. The governance structure makes coordination nearly impossible. The rivers fall under provincial jurisdiction. Groundwater regulation belongs to national agencies. The city government controls neither. 13 different municipalities share the metropolitan area, each with separate budgets and competing priorities. No single authority can implement a comprehensive solution because no single authority has comprehensive power. Corruption. Investigations have derailed multiple infrastructure projects over the past 2 decades. Political leaders announce initiatives that generate favorable headlines, then move to different positions before implementation fails become their responsibility. The incentive structure rewards announcing projects, not completing them. So Indonesia chose a third option, not to save Jakarta, not to manage its decline, but to leave. Nusantara is a city that does not exist yet. It is a patch of forest on the island of Borneo, 2,000 kilometers from Jakarta, where the Indonesian government plans to build a new capital from nothing. The budget is $32 billion. The timeline extends to 2045. Government ministries will relocate. Civil servants will follow. The administrative machinery of the world's 4th most populous nation will operate from a purpose-built city surrounded by rainforest instead of rising seawater. $32 billion. That is more than every Jakarta infrastructure project of the past 2 decades combined. The money exists. The political will exists. But it exists for leaving, not for staying. Jakarta will not disappear overnight. The factories will keep running until the economics no longer work. The ports will keep operating until the Subsidance makes them unusable. The 10 million residents who cannot afford to relocate will remain in neighborhoods where the water rises a little higher each year, where the rivers spread waste a little further each flood, where the wells pump water a little more contaminated each decade. Scientists have a term for what Jakarta is becoming. They call it managed retreat. What it actually means is that the people with resources will leave and the people without resources will adapt until adaptation is no longer possible. Indonesia looked at its capital and made a calculation. The cost of saving Jakarta exceeded the cost of starting over. This is not a failure of engineering. It is a decision about who deserves to be saved. Jakarta pumped its own ground into collapse. It turned its rivers into sewers. It poisoned the aquifer its residents drink from. And when the consequences became undeniable, the government announced it was building a new city for the people who could afford to follow. The rivers will keep flowing long after the last ministry relocates. The delta will keep sinking long after the last resident who could leave has left. Jakarta was not conquered by the ocean. It was hollowed out from within and handed back to the water that was always underneath.